The toast was a violation. Constance Vickers felt the wrongness of it in the chill that settled over the dining room, a cold that had nothing to do with the draught from the ill-fitting windows of Bramblehurst Park. Her aunt, Lady Arabella Bellamy, raised her crystal glass, the candlelight catching in the facets and throwing sharp, predatory sparks. "To a successful visit," Lady Arabella purred, her eyes fixed not on the guest of honor who had yet to arrive, but on her own daughter, Louisa. "And to a most advantageous union." Louisa, pretty and pale in her silks, blushed on cue. Constance, standing by the sideboard to ensure the decanters remained full, did not move a muscle. She was a fixture, a piece of the household machinery, as silent and necessary as the grandfather clock in the hall. Her role was to be invisible, and she had perfected it over the 7 years since her parents' deaths had left her a penniless ward in her aunt's grasping care. The toast was not for her. The silks were not for her. The advantageous union was most certainly not for her. It was a future being sold, and Constance, who managed the household books with a meticulous, desperate precision, knew exactly how high the price of failure would be. Bramblehurst Park was not merely drafty, it was drowning in debt, a fact hidden beneath a thin, cracking veneer of gentility. The guest of honor, the linchpin of Lady Arabella's entire scheme, was Gideon Devereux, the Duke of Kestrel Chase, a man of immense wealth and staggering tragedy, widowed young, and now, after years of mourning, re-entering society with the grim reluctance of a bear disturbed from hibernation. Every ambitious mother with a daughter of marriageable age in the county of Storrington was abuzz. But Lady Arabella was certain she had the advantage. Kestrel Chase was the neighboring estate. "Constance," Lady Arabella said, her voice dropping the honeyed tone and acquiring its familiar, sharp edge. "The Duke's carriage was sighted at the turn-off from Marley 10 minutes ago. See to it that cook has not burned the roast, and for heaven's sake, try to look less like a mourner at your own funeral. It casts a pall." Constance inclined her head. "Yes, Aunt." She did not say that the black bombazine dress she wore was the only one her aunt had permitted her in 2 years, its cuffs frayed and mended with her own neat, nearly invisible stitches. She did not say that her expression was simply one of concentration, of holding in her mind the 101 details required to make this evening appear effortless. The silver polished, the linens pressed, the fires lit, the staff paid from a household account that was perpetually, terrifyingly empty. She was the architect of this illusion, and her only reward was to be erased from the picture she created. She retreated to the kitchens, the domain of Mrs. Pegg, a cook whose temper was as fiery as her ovens. The woman glanced up, her face ruddy. "He's coming, is he? The great man himself?" "He is," Constance confirmed, her eyes scanning the preparations. The roast was perfect. The sauces simmered gently. "Everything appears in order. Thank you, Peg." The cook grunted, a sound that in her lexicon passed for high praise. "It's you we do it for, Miss Constance, not her ladyship." She wiped her hands on her apron. "You look tired. You've been at those ledgers again till all hours, haven't you?" "They must be made to balance," Constance said simply. It was a law of nature to her. The numbers had to align, even if the world around them was falling into chaos. She returned to the hall just as the heavy oak door swung open, admitting a gust of damp autumn air, and the Duke of Kestrel Chase. He was not what she had expected.
The county gossip painted him as a specter, a man hollowed out by grief. But the man who stood on the threshold, handing his hat and gloves to the butler, was not a ghost. He was a mountain.
Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a face that looked as if it had been carved from granite, he seemed to absorb the very light and sound from the hall. His eyes, a startlingly clear gray, swept the space with an unnerving, assessing quality, missing nothing. Lady Arabella and Louisa descended upon him in a flurry of silk and practiced smiles.
"Your Grace! Welcome, welcome to Bramblehurst."
Lady Bellamy. Miss Bellamy. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of pleasantry. It was the voice of a man who did not waste words. His gaze flickered past them, past the gleaming silver and the carefully arranged flowers, and for a single, shocking second, it landed on Constance. She was standing near the doorway to the dining room, ready to give the signal for the soup to be served. She had expected him to look through her, as everyone else did. But he did not. His eyes, cool and analytical, took in her plain dress, her steady posture, and the small, worn account book she held half hidden in the folds of her skirt. It was not a look of pity, or even curiosity. It was a look of recognition, as if he were a mathematician who had just spotted an integer where everyone else saw only wallpaper. The moment lasted no more than 3 seconds, but it was long enough to unravel the careful invisibility she had woven around herself for years. Then, his attention was reclaimed by her aunt, and he was guided into the dining room. Constance took a slow, steadying breath. She had been seen, and for the first time in a long time, she was not entirely sure whether that was a blessing or a curse. She thought of the crumbling ledgers, the mounting bills, the desperate hope pinned on this one cold, quiet man. And she thought of the single, wild, impractical idea she had been nursing for months, a secret plan she'd sketched out on the back of a discarded grocery list. A plan for an orchard. It was a foolish, impossible dream, a vision of life and fruitfulness in a world of decay. The Duke of Kestrel Chase, a man who seemed to embody the harsh reality of winter, would surely have no time for such things. He would laugh, or worse, he would not even notice it was there at all. The dinner was an exercise in futility. Louisa, coached within an inch of her life, spoke of poetry and watercolors, her voice a soft, fluttering thing. The Duke responded with monosyllables. He ate with an economy of motion, his attention seemingly fixed on the middle distance, though Constance, observing from her station by the sideboard, felt the unsettling weight of his awareness. He was not absent. He was listening. Not to the stilted conversation, but to the house itself, to the silence between the words, the faint scent of mildew beneath the polish, the subtle tremor of a structure under strain. Lady Arabella, growing desperate, began to boast. "We are so looking forward to the county ball at Dunsmuir, Your Grace. Louisa's dance card is already quite full, of course, but I am certain she could be persuaded to reserve the first waltz." "I do not waltz," the Duke stated flatly. The words fell into the conversation like stones into a pond, the ripples spreading into an awkward silence. Constance watched her aunt's smile tighten. She felt a flicker of something she rarely allowed herself, a grim, satisfying vindication. Her aunt's social machinations were as transparent and flimsy as a spider's web, and this man was a block of granite. He could not be caught. Later, as coffee was being served in the drawing room, a minor crisis unfolded. A footman, nervous under the Duke's stoic gaze, fumbled a tray. A cup of hot coffee tipped, splashing across a stack of papers on a side table. Lady Arabella let out a little shriek. "You clumsy oaf!" she hissed, her face contorting with fury. But the Duke's attention was on the papers. "Those are estate maps," he said, his voice sharp with sudden interest. Constance moved before anyone else could. She set down her tray, swiftly gathered the damp papers, and blotted them with a clean napkin. "They are copies only, Your Grace," she said, her voice calm and even. "The originals are locked away. These are merely survey drafts from the east pasture boundary." He turned his full attention to her. "You know them?" "I do," she replied. "The boundary dispute with Mr. Fenwick has been ongoing for 3 years. He claims the old stream bed as the marker, but the original survey of 1788 clearly delineates the line by the 5 ancient oaks, 2 of which have since fallen." She spoke with the unadorned clarity of a legal document. She had spent weeks poring over those maps, cross-referencing them with decades of letters and deeds. The Duke's gray eyes narrowed. He looked from her to Lady Arabella, whose face was a mask of stunned fury. It was not Louise's place to be knowledgeable about such things, and it was certainly not Constance's. "Who are you?" he asked. The question was not rude. It was a simple demand for data. Before Constance could answer, her aunt stepped in, laughing a brittle, false laugh. "Oh, that is just my niece, Constance. She has a head for figures, poor dear. Quite lost to the more feminine arts, I'm afraid. Constance, that is enough. Go and fetch a fresh pot of coffee." It was a dismissal, a public reduction of her back to servitude. Constance felt the familiar sting, but she held her head high. She curtsied. "Your Grace." As she turned to leave, the Duke spoke again, his voice cutting through her aunt's fluttering excuses. "Wait." Constance paused, her back to the room. "The ledgers for Bramblehurst," he said, not to Lady Arabella, but to her. "Who keeps them?" A deep silence fell. Constance could feel her aunt's rage burning into her back. This was a dangerous question. To answer truthfully would be to expose the lie of Lady Arabella's competent management. To lie would be impossible. She did not know how. She turned slowly. "I do, Your Grace." He nodded, a single, sharp movement of his chin. It was not an expression of surprise. It was one of confirmation. He looked as if he had just solved a complex equation and was satisfied with the result. "I see." He said nothing more on the subject for the rest of the evening. But as he was preparing to leave, while Lady Arabella was making a final, desperate attempt to secure a promise of a future visit, the Duke's gaze sought out Constance again. She was standing in the shadows of the hall, ready to bolt the door behind him. "Miss Vickers," he said, his voice low but carrying with absolute clarity. She stepped forward. "Your Grace?" He held out a small, leather-bound notebook and a silver pencil. "Tomorrow at 10. Bring the Bramblehurst ledgers for the past 5 years to the Kestrel Chase Estate Office. All of them." It was not a request. It was a command. Lady Arabella's face went white. "Your Grace, I assure you, that is not necessary. I can answer any questions you may have." He ignored her completely, his eyes still fixed on Constance. "Do you understand?" She met his gaze without flinching. In his eyes, she saw no warmth, no kindness. She saw something far rarer and, to her, more valuable. A recognition of her competence. He was not looking at a poor relation or a plain girl. He was looking at the person who knew the truth. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. "I understand perfectly." As the great door closed behind him, sealing Bramblehundred's Park back into its genteel decay, Constance clutched the worn account book to her chest. She had been summoned, not for a waltz,
not for her pretty face, but for her mind. And as she looked at her aunt's apoplectic expression, she knew that this summons was not just an order from a duke. It was a fault line, and the world she had known was beginning to fracture along it. The illusion was breaking. The next morning, Constance walked the 2 miles to Kestrel Chase.
She did not take the carriage. Her aunt had forbidden it, a petty act of spite. Constance did not mind. The crisp autumn air cleared her head, and the physical act of walking settled the tremor in her hands. She carried a heavy satchel containing the ledgers, the tangible record of her servitude, and Bramblehurst's slow collapse. Each neat column of figures, each carefully balanced page, was a testament to her thankless, invisible labor. Kestrel Chase was another world. Where Bramblehurst was crumbling, Kestrel Chase was merely sleeping. The great stone house stood amid acres of manicured parkland, but there was a stillness about it, a sense of suspended animation. The windows were like vacant eyes. No smoke rose from most of the chimneys. It was a house waiting for a command to live again. She was shown not to a drawing room, but to a stark, masculine office. Bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with volumes on agriculture, engineering, and law. A massive oak desk dominated the room, and behind it sat the Duke. He did not rise. "Miss Vickers," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "Place the books on the desk." She did so, laying out the 5 heavy volumes. He opened the most recent one, his long fingers tracing the columns of her elegant, precise script. He was silent for a full 10 minutes, turning pages, his expression unreadable. Constance sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. She was not afraid. Numbers did not lie. Finally, he looked up. "Bramblehurst is bankrupt," he stated. It was not an accusation, it was a fact. "It is insolvent, Your Grace," she corrected quietly. "The assets, if liquidated, would not cover the debts secured against the estate by your late father." He registered no surprise. "The loans from my father were made on the basis of friendship with your uncle. After his death, your aunt appears to have expanded her expenditures." He tapped a page detailing bills from a London modiste that amounted to more than the estate's entire quarterly income from tenant farms. "These are unsustainable." "I have advised her of that fact repeatedly," Constance said. "And she has ignored you." Again, a statement, not a question. He closed the ledger. "Lady Bellamy's plan is for me to marry her daughter, at which point she assumes I will forgive the debt and subsidize her lifestyle indefinitely." Constance said nothing. It was the truth, bald and unadorned. "Miss Bellamy is a pleasant young woman," the Duke continued, his voice devoid of any emotion. "She is also entirely unsuited to be the Duchess of Kestrel Chase. This estate is not a drawing room. It is a business. It requires management, not decoration." He leaned back in his chair, his gray eyes pinning her in place. "You, on the other hand, have kept a failing estate afloat for 3 years with no resources and no authority. You understand crop yields, tenant contracts, and fraudulent invoices. You have, in a word, competence." Constance felt her heart begin to beat a little faster. She did not know where this was going, but it was the most terrifying and exhilarating conversation of her life. "I have a proposal, Miss Vickers," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "It is not a romantic one. It is a contract. I require a duchess, one who can manage a household of this scale, oversee the accounts, and restore order to the chaos my grief has allowed to fester. I am not offering affection, or companionship in the conventional sense. I am offering a position, a partnership of a practical kind." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I will settle the Bramblehurst debts in their entirety. Your aunt will be granted a small but sufficient annuity, on the condition that she retires to Bath and troubles neither of us again. Your cousin, Miss Bellamy, will receive a respectable dowry, sufficient to secure her a suitable match with a country gentleman. You, in turn, will be free of them." He leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. "I am asking you to marry me, Miss Vickers, not for love or beauty or connection, but for your mind, for your skill with those ledgers. In return, I offer you a home, security, and a sphere of influence in which your talents will not be hidden or despised, but utilized. It will be a marriage in name, a business arrangement in fact. Those are my terms, plainly stated." Constance stared at him. Her mind, usually so quick and orderly, was a whirlwind. Marriage. To the Duke. Not out of love, but as a form of employment. To be the Duchess of Kestrel Chase. To trade one form of servitude for another, more gilded one? No, that was not what he was offering. He was offering her work. Meaningful work. He was offering her the keys to the kingdom, not to wear as jewelry, but to use. She thought of her aunt's daily cruelties. She thought of the endless, thankless mending and accounting. She thought of the future stretching before her at Bramblehurst, a slow, gray descent into impoverished spinsterhood. And then she thought of this cold, hard man offering her not a fairy tale, but a ledger. A bigger, more complex ledger than she had ever dreamed of. And in that moment, a flicker of her own secret dream surfaced. "Your Grace," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "At Kestrel Chase, you have an orchard." He looked momentarily confused. "There is an old apple orchard on the western slope. It has been neglected for a decade. The fruit is bitter, the trees overgrown." "It could be restored," she said, a sudden, fierce passion rising in her. "With proper pruning, grafting, and care, it could be made productive again. The right varieties could be cultivated, not just for the household, but for the tenants. Cider, preserves, dried apples for the winter months. It could be a resource." For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed the Duke's face. It was a faint, almost imperceptible amusement, a slight crinkle at the corners of his eyes. He laughed. It was not a real laugh, more a dry, humorless exhalation of air. "An orchard, Miss Vickers. I offer you control of one of the largest estates in the county, and your first thought is for a patch of derelict apple trees?" He shook his head slowly. "You may do as you wish with the gardens. It is a trivial matter." The dismissal stung more than he could know. Trivial. Her one, small, vibrant hope, the thing that was wholly hers, dismissed as a woman's fancy. It solidified her understanding of the bargain. He did not want her dreams. He wanted her skills. But his dismissal also gave her an opening. "You may do as you wish." She took a deep breath. She would accept the cold bargain for the freedom it offered, and in the corner of that freedom, she would cultivate her trivial, foolish, life-giving orchard. He could have the ledgers. She would have the trees. "Very well, Your Grace," Constance said,
her voice regaining its steady composure. "I accept your proposal." The wedding was a quiet, perfunctory affair at the village church in Marley, attended only by a grim-faced solicitor and the Duke's elderly, formidable grandmother, the Dowager Duchess Honora Devereux, who observed Constance with eyes as sharp and assessing as her grandson's. Lady Arabella and Louisa were conspicuously absent, already dispatched to their new lives with a swift, merciless efficiency that Constance found both terrifying and admirable. She was now the Duchess of Kestrel Chase. The words felt alien, a costume she had not yet learned how to wear. The journey from the church to the great house was made in silence. Gideon, he had instructed her to call him Gideon, though the name felt strange on her tongue, sat opposite her, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape. He looked no happier than he had on the day they met. He looked like a man who had completed a necessary but unpleasant piece of business.
As the carriage drew up to the front entrance, the entire household staff was assembled on the steps. At their head was a stout woman, with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun and an expression of profound disapproval. This, Constance knew, was Mrs. Ingram, the housekeeper who had served the Devereux family for 40 years. Gideon stepped out of the carriage and turned to hand her down. His touch was impersonal, his grip firm and cool. He led her to the top of the steps. "This is your new Duchess," he announced to the staff, his voice echoing in the unnerving silence. "Her orders are to be obeyed as if they were my own. Mrs. Ingram, you will provide her grace with the household keys and all account books." Mrs. Ingram curtsied, a stiff, resentful motion. "Your Grace." Her eyes met Constance's, and in them Constance saw a wall of suspicion and hostility. She was an outsider, a usurper. The first Duchess, the one they had all loved, had been a beautiful, laughing creature of sunshine and grace, or so the county legend went. Constance, in her plain gray traveling dress, with her quiet manner and her head full of figures, was her opposite in every way. Gideon turned to Constance. "The house is yours to manage. My offices are in the West Wing. I will not be disturbed unless the house is on fire." With that, he turned and strode into the house, disappearing into the shadows of the West Wing, leaving her alone on the steps with her silent, hostile army. The chill that descended was profound. It was the cold of a house steeped in grief, a place where life had been put on hold. Constance took a breath. She did not try to smile. She did not offer false pleasantries. She met Mrs. Ingram's gaze directly. "Mrs. Ingram," she said, her voice clear and steady, "if you would be so good as to show me to the housekeeper's office, we can begin with the accounts." The gauntlet had been thrown, not with charm, but with purpose. Mrs. Ingram's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. She had expected tears, or nerves, or perhaps a haughty command. She had not expected an immediate request to see the books. For the next week, Constance worked. She did not try to redecorate. She did not demand changes to the menu. She sat in the small, cold office with a mountain of ledgers, some dating back years. She traced the flow of money, the ordering of supplies, the payment of wages. She found mismanagement born of neglect, tradesmen in Marley overcharging for goods, deliveries going missing, wages for non-existent staff being drawn. The household was bleeding money, not from malice, but from a simple lack of oversight. She did not confront, she documented. She created new ledgers, a new system for ordering, a new schedule for inventories. Her handwriting, neat and spare, filled page after page. On the third day, Mrs. Ingram found her there, long after the rest of the house was asleep, a single candle burning, her face pale with concentration. The housekeeper had come to lock up, but she paused in the doorway. "The late Duchess, she never bothered with such things," Mrs. Ingram said, her voice tight. Constance looked up. "I am not the late Duchess," she said simply, without malice. "I am the one who bothers." She dipped her pen in the inkwell and made another entry. The next morning, when Constance came down, there was a second candle laid out on the desk in the housekeeper's office, and a thick woolen shawl had been draped over the back of her chair. Mrs. Ingram said nothing, but when she brought in the books from the butcher, she placed them on the desk and said, "I believe Mr. Hobbs has been weighing his thumb with the Sunday roast for the past year, Your Grace." It was the beginning of a thaw, a slow, grudging respect. Constance's authority came not from her title, but from her sheer, undeniable competence. The staff began to see the changes. Supplies were plentiful. Their wages were paid on the dot. The house ran more smoothly than it had in years. The chill began to recede, replaced by the quiet hum of a well-oiled machine. Once she had the household under control, Constance turned her attention to her own secret project. She put on a pair of sturdy boots and an old cloak and walked to the western slope. The orchard was worse than she had imagined, a tangled mess of thorny branches, the trees choked with ivy, the ground littered with small, bitter, worm-eaten apples. It looked hopeless. She spent an entire day just walking the rows, examining each tree, her fingers tracing the gnarled bark. She made notes in a small book. This one needed drastic pruning. That one was too far gone, good only for firewood. This one, a hardy-looking specimen, might be a good candidate for grafting. She went to the estate library, a vast, dusty room that no one had entered for years. She searched the shelves and found what she was looking for. Old, leather-bound books on husbandry and agriculture. She sat up late into the night, reading by candlelight, learning the forgotten arts of pomology. She drew up plans, diagrams, a schedule of work that would need to begin immediately if there was to be any hope of a harvest the following year. The next morning, she approached Gideon in his office. It was the first time she had sought him out since the day of her arrival. He looked up from his papers, his expression guarded. "The house is not on fire," she said, preempting his question. "I require 2 of the undergardeners and a wagon for the next month. I also need to place an order for pruning saws, grafting knives, and several dozen rootstocks from a nursery in Ewminster." He raised an eyebrow. "For what purpose?" "The orchard," she said. He stared at her for a moment, and then he gave that same dry, mirthless laugh. "Miss Vickers, Your Grace," he corrected himself. "Are you still entertaining that little fancy? I have tenants to manage, legal disputes to settle. I do not have time for horticultural experiments." "I am not asking for your time, Your Grace," she replied, her voice level. "I am requisitioning resources that are under my purview as Duchess. The household gardens and grounds fall within that sphere, as we agreed. The cost will be covered by the savings I have already made in the household budget." She placed a single sheet of paper on his desk. It was a summary of the funds she had recovered by eliminating fraudulent billing and inventory shrinkage. The sum was substantial. He looked at the paper, then back at her. The amusement in his eyes faded, replaced by that familiar, assessing look. He was weighing her, calculating. He saw the logic, the planning. It was not a whim. It was a project. "The men will grumble," he said, testing her. "They are used to an easy time of it." "Then they will learn to grumble and work at the same time," she said. "I will supervise them myself." He was silent for a long moment. He was the Duke. He could forbid it with a single word. But he had made a bargain. He had hired her for her competence, and this was competence in action, however oddly directed. He had given her a sphere of influence. To countermand her now over something so trivial would be to undermine the very authority he had granted her. He gave a curt nod. "Very well, do as you wish, but do not let it interfere with the running of the house." "It will not," she promised. As she turned to leave, he spoke one last time. "Constance." She paused. It was the first time he had used her name without it feeling like a correction. "The soil on that slope is poor," he said, his voice quiet. "Clay heavy. It holds the damp. The trees have never truly thrived." It was not a warning. It was a piece of data, offered without inflection. "I am aware," she said, without turning around. "I have a plan for that as well." She left his office, the victory tasting sweeter than any social triumph. He had laughed at her plan, but he had not stopped her. He had given her the tools she needed, and as she walked out into the pale autumn sunshine, Constance felt a stirring of something she hadn't felt in a very long time. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was purpose. The ground was poor and the trees were sick, but they were hers, and she would bring them back to life. The work in the orchard began. At first, the two gardeners, a wiry old man named Jem and a sullen youth called Wilf, were resentful. They were used to trimming hedges and scything lawns, not wrestling with a decade of thorny overgrowth under the direction of a plain-faced duchess in muddy boots. Constance did not command them from a distance. She was there every morning, her hair tied back, her hands protected by thick leather gloves, a pruning saw in her grip. She showed them rather than told them. She demonstrated the correct angle for a cut to encourage new growth, how to identify and remove cankerous limbs, how to clear the choking ivy without damaging the bark. Her knowledge, gleaned from the dusty books in the library, was practical and precise. She worked as hard as they did, her arms aching at the end of each day, her hands scratched and sore despite the gloves. Slowly, grudgingly, their attitude began to change. Jem, who had worked the Kestrel Chase grounds since he was a boy, started offering his own observations. "This one's a winter pearmain, Your Grace," he'd say, pointing to a gnarled trunk. "My granddad always said it made the best keeping cider." Wilf, the sullen youth, began to take a fierce pride in the neatness of the cleared ground and the satisfying geometry of the pruned branches. They stopped seeing a duchess and started seeing a master of her craft. Gideon observed this transformation from a distance. From the window of his office, he could see the small figures moving on the western slope. He saw his new wife, her skirts hitched up, her face smudged with dirt, directing the work with quiet authority. It was a perplexing sight. He had married her to be a chatelaine, an administrator. He had not expected her to be a farmer. He found it illogical. And yet, he could not deny the evidence before him. The tangled mess was slowly being tamed into orderly rows. There was a logic to her actions, even if he did not fully comprehend it. One afternoon, he walked out to the orchard. He told himself it was to inspect the progress, an act of ducal oversight. Constance was on a ladder, carefully sawing a dead branch from a large, promising-looking tree. She did not notice him approach. He stood for a moment, watching her. There was a grace to her movements, an economy of effort that he, a man who valued efficiency above all, could not help but admire. "The branch is heavier than it looks," he said, his voice making her start. She looked down, her expression guarded. "Your Grace, I have it under control. Nevertheless, he moved to the base of the ladder and steadied it. It is a long way to fall. She finished the cut, and the heavy branch thudded to the ground. She descended the ladder, her face flushed from the effort. She pulled off her gloves and pushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead, leaving a streak of dirt on her skin. In that moment, unadorned and unprepossessing, she looked more real than any woman he had ever met. The men are working well, he observed, his gaze sweeping over the cleared ground. They are good men, she replied. They simply required direction. My direction has been absent, he admitted, the words costing him more than she could know. It was the closest he had ever come to an apology. She merely nodded, accepting the statement as fact. The soil is indeed poor, she said, changing the subject, kicking at a clod of heavy, wet clay with the toe of her boot. We are digging in sand and compost from the stable middens to improve the drainage. Next spring I intend to plant clover between the rows to fix nitrogen in the soil. He listened as she spoke, her words precise, her plan detailed. She spoke of rootstocks resistant to blight, of grafting heritage apple varieties known for their flavor and keeping qualities, the golden pippin, the Ribston pippin, the Ashmead's kernel. Names that were like a form of poetry to her. It was not a fancy, it was a science. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw past the administrator he had hired. He saw a creator, a nurturer, a woman who looked at a dying thing and saw not an end, but a beginning. It was a way of seeing the world that was utterly alien to him, a man who had spent 5 years presiding over the slow decay of his own life. You believe this will work, he said. It was not a question. I know it will, she answered with quiet certainty. It will take time, 3 years for a good harvest, but it will work. He said nothing more, but when he walked back to the house, something within him had shifted. He had married her for her ability to manage his present. He had not expected her to be planting a future. The arrival of the Dowager Duchess Honora Devereux for her annual autumn visit was an event that struck fear into the hearts of the Kestrel Chase staff. She was a woman of formidable intelligence and a tongue that could strip paint from a carriage door. She had disapproved of Gideon's first wife, finding her frivolous, and she arrived with a deep-seated skepticism about his second. She swept into the hall, a tiny, erect figure in black silk, and surveyed the scene with piercing blue eyes. The hall was warmer than it had been in years. The scent of beeswax hung in the air. There were late-blooming chrysanthemums in a vase on the hall table. Well, she announced, to no one in particular, it appears the house has a pulse again. Where is she? Constance came down the main staircase to greet her. She wore a simple dark blue dress, the one she had commissioned for formal dinners. It was well made, but unadorned. She did not rush. She did not gush. She descended with a calm, steady grace. Your Grace, Constance said, giving a slight curtsy. Welcome to Kestrel Chase. Honora's eyes raked over her, from the neat coil of her brown hair to the tips of her sensible shoes. So, you are the one my grandson has purchased to balance his books. The insult was deliberate, designed to provoke a reaction. Constance did not flinch. I am the Duchess of Kestrel Chase, she replied evenly, and the books are, indeed, now balanced. A flicker of something, respect, surprise, crossed the dowager's face. She had expected a flustered girl. She found a woman made of sterner stuff. At least you have no false airs about you. Gideon tells me you've been digging in the mud like a common laborer. The orchard required attention, Constance said. I gave it. Show me, the dowager commanded. Constance led her not to the drawing room for tea, but out into the grounds, towards the western slope. The old woman was surprisingly spry, keeping pace with Constance, her black skirts rustling over the grass. When they reached the orchard, Honora stopped and surveyed the scene. The dead wood had been cleared and stacked for firewood. The trees stood in neat, pruned rows, their bare branches stark against the gray sky. The ground between them had been turned and amended. It was a place of order, of intention. "This was your idea?" Honora asked, her voice sharp. "It was," Constance confirmed. "Gideon laughed at you, I suppose?" Constance was startled. "He expressed skepticism." "He is a fool," the dowager stated with conviction. "A clever fool, but a fool nonetheless. He sees the world in columns of figures. He has forgotten that wealth comes from the land, not from a ledger. His father knew that. His grandfather knew that. This," she said, gesturing with her cane at the orchard, "is work. Real work. Not the shuffling of papers he occupies himself with." She turned and looked Constance square in the eye. "My grandson has been half dead for 5 years. He lives in the past, in a shrine to a woman who was lovely and charming and utterly useless. He married you as a tool. But you, I think, are not a tool. You are a gardener. You plant things. Perhaps you can even make something grow in the barren soil of this family." It was the most profound encouragement Constance had ever received. It came from the most unlikely of sources, a woman whose disapproval was legendary. Standing there in the cold, clean air, with the scent of turned earth around her, Constance felt the last of her old life at Bramblehurst fall away. She was not a ward, not a servant, not even just a duchess by contract. She was the woman who was bringing the orchard back to life. And in the sharp, discerning eyes of the dowager, she saw that her quiet, steady work was, for the first time, truly seen and truly valued. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The winter passed, cold and long. Constance managed the house with quiet efficiency. Gideon remained in his wing, a remote, brooding presence. They met at dinner each evening, where the Dowager Duchess presided over their stilted conversations, her sharp questions forcing them into a semblance of communication. She would ask Constance about the orchard, about the household, and then turn to Gideon and demand to know about tenant disputes or market prices, weaving their separate worlds together with the threads of her indomitable will. Spring arrived, and with it, the first signs of life in the orchard. Tiny green buds appeared on the pruned branches. Constance, with Jem and Wilf's help, began the painstaking work of grafting. She had ordered scions, small cuttings from proven heritage trees, from across the country. With a surgeon's precision, she sliced into the bark of the existing trees and inserted the new wood, binding the wounds with wax and cloth. It was delicate, hopeful work. One evening, Gideon found her in the library, a book on fruit tree blights open before her. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the way the candlelight softened the severe lines of her face. "Mrs. Ingram tells me you have averted a trade union dispute with the stable hands," he said. Constance looked up, her focus shifting from the book to him. It was not a dispute. Their yearly allowance for boots was insufficient. I reviewed the accounts, found the original figure was set 12 years ago, and adjusted it for the current price of leather. It was a simple correction. The head groom, a man named Hobb, has been complaining about it for 5 years. I was told he was a malcontent. He is a man who needed new boots, she replied simply. He walked further into the room. And the orchard? Your grafts are taking? Most of them, she said, a hint of warmth entering her voice. The Ribston pippins are thriving. I have some concern about mildew on the south-facing row, but I believe I have a remedy. He looked at the book in her hands, at the neat pages of notes beside it. He had spent his day reviewing contracts worth thousands of pounds. She had spent hers worrying about mildew and stable boots. And yet, for the first time, he felt that her work was no less vital than his own. It was, perhaps, more so. It was the work of tending to life itself. Honora believes you are a sorceress, he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. She says you are waking the house from a spell. I am simply doing my job, Your Grace, Constance said, though his words sent a strange warmth through her. Gideon, he corrected her gently. My name is Gideon. It was a small thing, but it felt momentous. A crack in the formal facade of their arrangement. The summer brought new challenges, not from the land, but from society. The news of the Duke's strange marriage had spread, and the county was alive with gossip, fanned into flame by a particularly vicious source, Miss Theodosia Sinclair. The daughter of a neighboring baronet, Theodosia had long considered herself the front-runner to become the next Duchess of Kestrel Chase. She was beautiful, polished, and deeply resentful. She began to call at Kestrel Chase, her visits dripping with false friendship. "My dear Duchess," she would say to Constance, her eyes sweeping over Constance's simple dress with pity. "How wonderful to see you looking so well. The country air must agree with you. I confess, I would be lost without my weekly trips to my London dressmaker." Constance met her veiled insults with a polite, impenetrable calm. She served her tea and listened to her chatter, her composure never wavering. But Theodosia's poison was not just for her ears. It spread through the drawing rooms of Storrington and Dunsmuir. Constance was a grasping, low-born creature who had tricked the grieving Duke into a ruinous marriage. She was an oddity, a woman who preferred dirt to diamonds. The whispers reached a crescendo when Theodosia discovered that the new Duchess had sold off a set of the late Duchess's jewels. The story was that Constance had done it to pay for her vulgar farming experiments. The truth, as Gideon knew, was that Constance had identified the jewels as fakes, paste copies purchased by his first wife to pay a secret gambling debt. Constance had quietly disposed of them to avoid a scandal that would tarnish the memory his first wife, Amelia, had left behind. He had approved the action, impressed by her discretion. But Theodosia's version was far more compelling. The county began to turn. Invitations to social events dwindled. When Constance went into the village of Marley, she was met with cold stares and whispers. That is how counties turn on their own. Quietly. By degrees. Gideon was aware of the rumors. He dismissed them as the idle chatter of fools. But he saw the toll it was taking. He saw the slight tensing of Constance's shoulders when a carriage passed them on the road without its occupants acknowledging them. He saw the way she retreated further into her work, finding solace in the orderly rows of the orchard. One afternoon, Theodosia went too far. She arrived at Kestrel Chase with a group of her friends, ostensibly for a walk in the grounds. They found Constance in the walled garden, consulting with the head gardener. "Oh, look!" Theodosia cried, her voice carrying for all to hear. "Her Grace is at her accounts again, counting carrots instead of carrots, I suppose." Her friends tittered. Constance slowly straightened up, her face pale, but her expression composed.
"Miss Sinclair,"
she said, her voice quiet but firm.
"Welcome. I was not expecting you."
"Clearly," Theodosia said, her eyes maliciously bright.
"We were just admiring the grounds, though the orchard on the hill looks rather like an army of skeletons. Such a gloomy view. The late Duchess would never have allowed it. She had such a talent for beauty."
The comparison was a deliberate, cruel cut. Constance felt the sting of it, the implication that she was a creature of death and ugliness, destroying the beauty that Amelia had cultivated. Before she could form a reply, a low voice cut through the air. The late Duchess also had a talent for running up debts that would have beggared a king. Gideon stood at the entrance to the garden, his face like a thundercloud. He had overheard everything. Theodosia and her friends froze, their smiles vanishing. He walked slowly towards them, his eyes fixed on Theodosia. "Miss Sinclair, my wife's work in the orchard is not a matter for your amusement. It is an investment in the future of this estate, a future you clearly know nothing about." He stopped directly in front of her. "As for the late Duchess, I will thank you not to speak of her. You are not fit to mention her name." His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it held a chilling authority. "Your visit is at an end. Do not call here again." Theodosia paled, stammered a protest, but the look in his eyes silenced her. She gathered her friends and fled, leaving a shocked silence in her wake. Constance stared at him, her heart pounding. He had defended her, publicly. He had shattered the polite fictions surrounding his first marriage to protect her. He turned to her, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Are you all right?" She could only nod, words failing her. "The gossip of these people is meaningless," he said, his voice rough. "Let them talk. Our work is what matters." He used the word our work. He looked past her, towards the orchard on the hill, its skeletal branches reaching for the sky. For the first time, he was not looking at her project. He was looking at theirs. The crisis had passed, but in its place, a new and fragile alliance had been forged. He had not just defended her honor, he had claimed her work, and her, as his own. Theodosia Sinclair, however, was not a woman to accept defeat. Humiliated and enraged, her animosity towards Constance curdled from social sniping into something far more dangerous. She knew she could not attack the Duke directly, so she resolved to destroy the one thing he had publicly defended: his strange, dirt-stained Duchess. She needed a weapon, something that could not be dismissed as mere gossip. She needed proof of Constance's unworthiness, a stain so dark it would force Gideon to cast her aside. The opportunity came during the annual harvest festival at Kestrel Chase, a tradition Gideon had reluctantly revived at Constance's quiet urging. It was an event for the tenants and staff, a day of games, feasting, and community. The Dowager Duchess Honora was in residence, presiding over the affair like a benevolent queen. The centerpiece of the festival was a display of the estate's bounty. Constance had arranged it herself: sheaves of wheat, pyramids of vegetables, and, from a few of the older, healthier trees in the orchard, a small, hopeful collection of early apples. But the true treasure on display was the Devereux sapphire, a legendary necklace of staggering value worn by the Duchess of Kestrel Chase on this one day each year as a symbol of the family's prosperity. It had belonged to Gideon's mother, and Amelia, his first wife, had worn it with dazzling effect. Constance had been hesitant to wear it. It felt like a costume from a life that was not hers. But the dowager had been firm. "It is not a piece of jewelry, child. It is a part of your office. The tenants expect it. Wear it." And so, Constance wore the cascade of deep blue gems over her simple gown. She felt its weight on her collarbones, a cold, heavy burden of history and expectation. During the festivities, Theodosia Sinclair made a surprise appearance, claiming she had come to make amends for her previous behavior. Her apology to Gideon was cloyingly sweet, her compliments to Constance effusive. Constance, though wary, accepted her presence with quiet grace. No one saw the brief moment when Theodosia, under the pretense of admiring the necklace, leaned close to Constance, her fingers brushing against the clasp. No one saw the quick, almost invisible flicker of her hand as she, accidentally, bumped into a young, nervous serving maid named Tilly. An hour later, a cry went up. Tilly, the serving maid, was in hysterics. She had been sent to Constance's dressing room to fetch a shawl and had found a drawer slightly ajar. Inside, tucked beneath a stack of plain linen chemises, was the Devereux sapphire. But it was not the whole necklace. The magnificent central stone, a sapphire the size of a robin's egg, had been pried from its setting. It was missing. The implication was immediate and horrific. The new Duchess, the woman with the common background, had attempted to steal the most valuable part of the necklace, hiding the damaged setting amongst her things, planning to sell the stone later. It was a crime not just of theft, but of desecration. Panic erupted. The local magistrate, a pompous man named Mr. Osmond, was summoned from the feast. Theodosia Sinclair looked shocked and horrified, wringing her hands and saying, "Oh, the poor Duke! To be so betrayed! I never would have believed it, but she always seemed so grasping." Constance stood frozen in the center of the storm, the blood draining from her face. All eyes were on her. The shocked faces of the tenants, the suspicious glare of the magistrate, the triumphant, pitying gaze of Theodosia. She looked for Gideon. He was standing by the fireplace, his face an unreadable mask of granite. He was looking not at her, but at the damaged necklace lying on a velvet cloth. This was the crisis, the test of their fragile, unspoken trust. Everything Theodosia had been working towards had led to this moment. All the rumors, all the whispers, had now been given a terrible, tangible form. The magistrate, Mr. Osmond, puffed out his chest. "Your Grace," he said to Constance, his tone oozing a new and unpleasant authority, "this is a most serious matter, a very serious matter indeed. I must ask you to explain how this came to be in your possession in this damaged state." Constance found her voice. It was thin, but steady. "I do not know. I wore the necklace until after the midday meal. I then returned it to its case in my dressing room." "And you did not notice the great sapphire was missing?" Mr. Osmond sneered. "I did not examine it. I simply put it away." "How very convenient," Theodosia murmured, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. The magistrate turned to Gideon. "Your Grace, this is a delicate situation, but the evidence is plain. The necklace was found amongst her belongings." Gideon did not look at him. His gray eyes finally lifted and met Constance's across the room. His expression was cold, analytical. The warmth she had begun to see in him was gone, replaced by the dispassionate gaze of a judge. "Constance," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent room. "Did you do this? Did you break the necklace and hide it?"
The question was a physical blow. He did not defend her. He did not dismiss the accusation. He asked. He doubted. In that moment, Constance felt the floor give way beneath her. The fragile trust they had built, the partnership she had begun to believe in, it all seemed to be dissolving under the heat of his suspicion. The hurt was so sharp, so sudden, it almost stole her breath. She looked at his cold face, and a strange, steely calm settled over her. She had endured her aunt's cruelty, the county's scorn, and the back-breaking labor of restoring the orchard. She would endure this, too. She would not cry. She would not beg. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. Evidence did. She met his gaze and held it. Her own voice, when she spoke, was as clear and cold as his. "No," she said. "I did not." The single word hung in the air, a simple, unadorned statement of fact. It was not a plea. It was a testimony. Gideon continued to stare at her, his expression unyielding. 1 second, 2, 3. It felt like an eternity. To Constance, it felt like a verdict on her entire life. Was she, in the end, just another column in his ledger, one that had failed to balance? Then he broke his gaze from hers and turned to the magistrate. "Mr. Osmond," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "My wife has given her answer. Now we will find the truth. The gates to the estate are to be sealed. No one enters or leaves. Every person at this festival, guest and servant alike, will be questioned. Search the grounds. Search every room."
We are not finished here until the sapphire is found and the true thief is identified. He had not proclaimed her innocence, but he had not accepted her guilt. He had demanded what he always prized above all else: evidence. For Constance, it was not the passionate defense she might have dreamed of, but it was something harder and perhaps more real. It was a stay of execution and a chance to prove that her word, like her ledger's, was true. The investigation began, and Constance knew she was no longer fighting for a necklace, but for her name, her home, and the very foundation of her new life. The great house of Kestrel Chase, once a place of celebration, became a fortress of suspicion. Under the Duke's cold, unwavering command, the magistrate and his men began their work. Guests were detained in the grand ballroom. Servants were questioned in the library. The atmosphere was thick with tension and fear. Constance was escorted to her rooms, a guard posted at her door. She was a prisoner in her own home. She sat not in the plush chairs of the main bedchamber, but in the small, austere dressing room where the necklace had been found. She did not pace. She did not weep. She sat at her small writing desk, took out a clean sheet of paper, and began to do the only thing she knew how to do when faced with chaos. She began to create order. She started a timeline. She listed every person she had spoken to, every place she had been that day, with precise times. She noted when she had put on the necklace, who had been nearby, when she had taken it off. Her mind, a storehouse of meticulously organized detail, began to work, sifting through the day's events, searching for the anomaly, the detail that did not fit. Downstairs, the Dowager Duchess Honora was conducting her own investigation. She had dismissed Mr. Osmond's bumbling inquiries with a wave of her hand, and was now systematically interrogating the key players herself. Her first target was Tilly, the hysterical serving maid. "Stop your sniveling, girl," Honora commanded, her voice like cracking ice. "Tears will not help you. Now tell me everything. Who told you to fetch the Duchess's shawl?"
It was Miss Sinclair, Your Grace," Tilly sobbed. "She said Her Grace was feeling a chill."
"A chill? On the warmest day we've had all autumn?" Honora's eyes narrowed. "And when you entered the room, what did you see?"
"The drawer, Your Grace. It was open, just a crack. I only meant to close it, I swear. And I saw the sparkle."
"You saw the sparkle," Honora repeated slowly. "How convenient. And Miss Sinclair, where was she when you made this dramatic discovery?"
"She was right behind me. She'd followed me up the stairs. She said she wanted to help."
Honora's gaze was sharp enough to pierce steel. "I am quite sure she did." Meanwhile, Gideon was in his office, not questioning witnesses, but examining an object. It was the damaged necklace setting. He used a jeweler's loop, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was not a man for gossip or intuition. He was a man of physics, of mechanics. He studied the twisted gold claws that had once held the great sapphire. They were bent, distorted, but they were not broken. Prying a stone from such a setting would require immense force, or a specific tool. It would leave marks. He sent for the estate blacksmith, a man with hands like shovels and a deep knowledge of metals. "Look at this," Gideon commanded. "Tell me how it was done." The blacksmith examined the setting. "Not pried, Your Grace. Not with a knife, anyway. The marks are wrong. Looks more like it was squeezed. Hard. Like with pliers, maybe. But the angle is odd. It's been twisted, see?" Gideon saw. The claws had been bent sideways, releasing the stone. It was not the clumsy work of a thief tearing at a jewel. It was deliberate, precise. It was the work of someone who understood how the setting was constructed. Back in her room, Constance's mind snagged on a detail: the bump. Theodosia bumping into Tilly in the hall. It had seemed an accident, but now she replayed it in her mind's eye. Theodosia's hand near Tilly's apron pocket. A swift, almost invisible motion. Was it possible? A knock came at her door. It was the Dowager Duchess. The guard stood aside to let her pass. "I have spoken to the maid," Honora announced without preamble. "The girl is a fool, but I do not believe she is a liar. She is, however, terrified, and she was prompted by Theodosia Sinclair." Constance looked up from her timeline. "I believe Miss Sinclair may have planted the necklace on Tilly to be found." "Planted the necklace, perhaps," Honora mused. "But the stone? Where is the stone? A thief does not separate the parts of her loot until she is clear of the scene of the crime. It makes no sense. Unless the goal was not the theft itself." "The goal was the accusation," Constance said, the pieces clicking into place. "The goal was to have me found with a damaged, incomplete piece of jewelry. To make me look like a clumsy, incompetent thief who panicked." "Precisely," Honora agreed. "Which means the sapphire is still in this house. And the person who has it is the person who twisted it from its setting." At that moment, Gideon entered the room. He held a pair of small, elegant silver pliers in his hand. They were filigreed, ornate, a gentleman's tool. "These were found in the carriage of Miss Sinclair's coachman," he said, his voice grim. The coachman confesses she gave them to him to dispose of in the village pond. He placed them on the desk next to Constance's timeline. The blacksmith confirms the marks on the pliers match the marks on the necklace setting. Constance looked at the pliers, then at Gideon. He was holding the evidence. He had found it. He had followed the logic, not his emotions. "The stone is still missing," she said quietly. "Yes," he agreed. "And a search of Miss Sinclair's person and possessions has revealed nothing. She is a cool customer. She denies everything." "Because the stone is not on her person," Honora said, a slow, grim smile spreading across her face. "She is clever, but not clever enough. She knows we would search her. She would have to hide it somewhere no one would dare to look. Somewhere public. Somewhere symbolic." The three of them stood in silence for a moment, their minds working along the same track. Where would a vain, arrogant woman hide a priceless gem in plain sight? "The harvest display," Constance breathed. Gideon nodded. She was seen admiring the prize-winning pumpkin for an inordinate amount of time. Without another word, they swept out of the room and down the great staircase, a formidable trio of purpose. They strode into the now empty feasting hall, where the harvest display still stood. Gideon walked directly to the largest pumpkin, a monstrous orange globe that had won first prize for a tenant farmer named Fletcher. He drew a small knife from his pocket. Theodosia, who was being detained with the other guests in the ballroom next door, must have heard the commotion. She appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of indignation, flanked by the magistrate. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded. "Have you gone mad?" Gideon ignored her. He inserted the tip of the knife into the top of the pumpkin and carved a small, neat circle around the stem. He lifted the lid. The air filled with the sweet, earthy scent of raw pumpkin. And nestled deep within the pulpy, stringy flesh, winking in the candlelight like a malevolent blue eye, was the Devereux sapphire. A collective gasp went through the room. Theodosia Sinclair's face went ashen. All her poise, all her arrogance shattered in an instant, leaving behind only the ugly truth of her guilt. The magistrate, Mr. Osmond, stared, his mouth agape. I do not understand." Gideon turned his cold, furious gaze upon Theodosia. "It is quite simple, Mr. Osmond. Miss Sinclair is not a thief. She is a slanderer. She did not want the sapphire. She wanted my wife's ruin. She damaged the necklace, planted it on a servant to be discovered in the Duchess's room, and hid the stone where she thought no one would find it until long after the blame had been laid and the sentence passed. It was a clever plan, but she underestimated my wife's memory, my grandmother's insight, and my own determination to see evidence, not theatrics." He stepped towards Theodosia, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "Your family will receive a bill for the repair of the necklace. You will write a full and public confession and apology to the Duchess. And then you will leave this county, and you will never return. If I ever see your face in Storrington again, I will personally see you prosecuted not just for this, but for every lie you have ever told. Do you understand me? Plainly." Theodosia, broken and exposed, could only nod, tears of humiliation streaming down her face. Her public reckoning was complete. It was not swift and clean, but slow, methodical, and absolute. Gideon then turned to the assembled tenants and staff. His voice rang with an authority no one had ever heard from him before. "Let this be the end of it. The Duchess's name is cleared. Her honor is my honor. If I hear one more whisper against her, that person will find themselves without a home on my land or a place in my household. Let that be understood." He then walked to Constance. He stood before her, the great sapphire in the palm of his hand. He looked at her, and the coldness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a profound, raw emotion she could not name. It was not pity. It was something harder and more respectful. It was awe. "It seems," he said, his voice rough, "that I owe you an apology." The aftermath of the public reckoning was quiet and swift. Theodosia Sinclair and her family vanished from the county overnight, a black carriage in the dead of night erasing them from the social landscape of Storrington. A formal, stilted letter of apology arrived for Constance, but she gave it no more than a passing glance before setting it aside. The victory was not in the letter. It was in the truth, laid bare for all to see. The Devereux sapphire was sent to a master jeweler in London to be repaired, and the great house of Kestrel Chase settled back into its rhythm. But it was a new rhythm. The air was clearer. The lingering shadows of suspicion had been scoured away. That evening, a hard, unseasonable frost was forecast. A killing frost, the kind that could ruin a harvest overnight. Panic began to ripple through the tenant farms. The wheat was mostly in, but the vegetable crops, the potatoes and cabbages that would see families through the winter, were still vulnerable. A blight had already weakened the potato crop across the county, and this frost could well be the final blow. Gideon was in his office, meeting with his steward, their faces grim as they reviewed the potential losses. There was talk of rent forgiveness, of distributing grain from the estate's own stores, but they both knew it might not be enough. Winter was coming, and it looked to be a hungry one. It was then that Constance entered the office. She carried not a single sheet of paper, but a thick, new ledger. She placed it on the desk before Gideon and the steward. "Your Grace," she said, her voice calm and steady, "I believe I have a solution." Gideon looked at her, then at the ledger. He opened it. The pages were filled with her neat, precise script. But these were not columns of figures representing debts and expenditures. These were inventories. Page after page detailed the yield from her restored orchard. Not from the new grafts, which were still years from bearing fruit, but from the old, hardy trees she had saved. She had not expected a large crop of fresh apples, and she had not gotten one. The fruit was still too small, too tart for the table. But it was plentiful. The ledger detailed what she had done with it. So many barrels of hard cider, pressed and stored in the cool of the deepest cellars. So many hundredweights of apples, peeled, cored, and dried on racks in a converted outbuilding, now like sweet, leathery coins. So many stone jars of apple butter, cooked down with spices until it was a dark, rich paste, and hundreds of bushels of the firmest apples, packed in straw in the old ice house, preserved for months by the steady, deep cold. Gideon read, his eyes widening. The steward leaned over his shoulder, his expression one of dawning astonishment. The sheer volume of preserved food was staggering. "Constance," Gideon began, his voice hoarse. "What is this?" "It is the orchard's yield," she said simply. "I knew the fresh fruit would be poor this first year, so I planned for preservation. It is not a feast, but it is sustenance. There is enough here, if distributed carefully, to supplement the diet of every tenant family on this estate through the winter. No one at Kestrel Chase will go hungry." The full scope of her foresight, of her quiet, relentless work, hit Gideon with the force of a physical blow. While he had been managing the decline, she had been cultivating survival. While he had been looking at the bottom line, She had been looking at the horizon. He had laughed at her plan. He had called it a trivial fancy. And that trivial fancy was about to save his people. He looked up from the ledger, his eyes meeting hers. He saw no triumph in her expression, no hint of, "I told you so." He saw only the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. He rose from his desk and walked around to her. He did not speak. He simply took her hands in his. Her hands were not the soft, useless hands of a lady. They were capable, strong, the knuckles slightly rough, the palms calloused from work. They were the hands that had pruned the dead wood, that had penned the ledgers, that had, in 1,000 quiet ways, saved them all. "You fed the tenants through winter," he said, his voice filled with a wonder that humbled him to his core. Later that night, long after the house was silent, Gideon found her in the orchard. The moon was high and bright, casting the pruned, leafless branches in stark, silver relief. A hard frost was settling over the ground, glittering like diamond dust. It was bitterly cold, but she stood there, a cloak wrapped around her, looking out over the sleeping trees. He came and stood beside her, not speaking for a long time. The silence between them was no longer awkward or empty. It was filled with everything that had passed between them: the bargain, the work, the suspicion, the vindication. "I laughed at you," he said finally, his voice low and raw in the cold air. "When you first spoke of this place, I thought it was a woman's whim. I saw only dying trees. I could not see the life you saw." She turned to him, her face pale in the moonlight. "You see it now?" "I see it now," he confirmed. "I see everything. I married you for your competence, Constance. I thought I was making a clever bargain, hiring an administrator. I was a fool." He took a step closer, his gaze intense. "I thought I was offering you a rescue from Bramblehurst, but I was the one who was trapped. In a cold, silent house, in a cold, silent life. I was drowning in the past. You came here, and you did not try to fill the silence with chatter. You filled it with purpose. You woke this house up. You woke me up." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was no longer impersonal. It was filled with a reverence that made her tremble. "This was not a business arrangement," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not for a long time. I have watched you work. I have watched you endure insults with a dignity I can only envy. I have watched you create life where there was only decay. I did not fall in love with a duchess. I fell in love with a gardener, a bookkeeper, a woman who sees the truth and is not afraid of it." He dropped to one knee before her on the frozen ground, his ducal pride dissolving in the face of a greater truth. He took her hand, raising it to his lips. "My name is Gideon," he said, "and I love you. I am not commanding you. I am not offering you a contract. I am asking, plainly, will you be my wife? Not in name, in truth. Will you choose me, Constance, as I choose you?" Tears, the tears she had refused to shed for sorrow or humiliation, finally came, blurring the moonlight. They were tears of a profound, overwhelming joy. She looked down at this proud, cold man, brought to his knees not by weakness, but by the sheer force of his own revelation. He was offering her not a rescue, but a choice. Her first true choice. And she chose. "Yes," she whispered, her voice catching. "Yes, Gideon. Together." He rose and drew her into his arms, and in the heart of the sleeping orchard, under the cold, bright moon, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of recognition. a quiet, certain sealing of a new and far more sacred bargain, a promise of a shared future, a harvest of the heart they would reap together for all the years to come. 1 year later, the orchard on the western slope was transformed. The young grafts had taken, their leaves a vibrant, healthy green. The older trees, properly cared for, were heavy with the promise of fruit. Between the rows, clover grew thick, its purple blossoms alive with the hum of bees from the hives Constance had established near the old stone wall. The place was no longer a skeleton. It was a testament to life, a vibrant, breathing part of the estate. Kestrel Chase itself was similarly changed. Laughter was heard in the halls. The fires burned brightly in every hearth. The staff, devoted to their capable, kind duchess, served with a loyalty that went far beyond duty. The house was no longer a monument to grief, but a home, warm and alive. The Dowager Duchess Honora was a near-permanent resident, claiming the country air suited her constitution. In truth, she delighted in watching the quiet, steady partnership between her grandson and his wife. She spent her afternoons with Constance, ostensibly advising her on estate matters, but mostly just enjoying her company. The two of them a formidable alliance of sharp minds and practical purpose. Louisa Bellamy, Constance's cousin, had married a respectable squire from a neighboring county, her dowry securing her a life of comfortable obscurity, free from her mother's ambitions. Lady Arabella remained in Bath, her letters, infrequent and filled with complaints, a distant echo of a former life. On a bright afternoon in late summer, Gideon found Constance in the orchard. She was not working. She was sitting on a simple wooden bench he had ordered placed there for her, a book lying forgotten in her lap. She was watching their son, a sturdy, dark-haired baby of 6 months, who was sleeping peacefully in a basket at her feet. Gideon came and sat beside her, slipping his arm around her shoulders. She leaned her head against him, a familiar, comfortable gesture. They sat in silence for a while, looking out at the rows of thriving trees. "The first apples from the Ribston pippin grafts will be ready soon," she said softly. "I remember when you told me it would take 3 years for a good harvest," he replied, his voice laced with affection. "You said it with such certainty." "I believe in planting things," she said, a smile touching her lips, "and in giving them time to grow." He looked from the trees to the sleeping baby, and then to his wife's calm, intelligent face. He thought of the cold, closed-off man he had been, and the life of quiet, purposeful joy he now lived. She had planted a future for him he could never have imagined. He reached into his pocket and drew out a small object wrapped in velvet. He placed it in her hand. "I had this made for you." She unwrapped it. It was not a grand piece of jewelry. It was a locket, simple and elegant, made of polished silver. She opened it. Inside, there was not a miniature portrait. On one side was a tiny, exquisitely carved apple, its leaf rendered in green gold. On the other side, in script so small it was barely legible, were 2 words. Plainly, together. Constance's eyes filled with tears, the happy, easy tears she was no longer afraid to shed. She looked at him, her heart so full it felt it might burst. "Gideon," she whispered. He took the locket and fastened it around her neck. "A reminder," he said softly, "of the terms of our contract." She laughed, a sound that was still a small miracle to him. She leaned in and kissed him, a slow, sweet kiss that tasted of sunshine and contentment. As they sat there, the baby stirred in his basket, and from the house the dinner bell rang, a cheerful, welcoming sound. The life they had built together, piece by piece, ledger by ledger, apple by apple, was calling to them.
It was a life of order and purpose, of love and quiet joy. A life that had grown, against all odds, from the barren soil of a forgotten orchard. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.